Chapter 16 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 16. The Lad with the Silver Button across Morvan. There is a regular ferry from Torosay to Kinlochaline on the mainland. Both shores of the Sound are in the country of the strong clan of the Macleans, and the people that passed the ferry with me were almost all of that clan. The skipper of the boat, on the other hand, was called Neil Roy Macrob, and since Macrob was one of the names of Alan's clansmen, and Alan himself had sent me to that ferry, I was eager to come to private speech of Neil Roy. In the crowded boat this was of course impossible, and the passage was a very slow affair. There was no wind, and as the boat was wretchedly equipped, we could pull but 2 oars on one side and one on the other. The men gave way, however, with a good will, the passengers taking spells to help them, and the whole company giving the time in Gaelic boat songs. And what with the songs, and the sea air, and the good nature and spirit of all concerned, and the bright weather, the passage was a pretty thing to have seen. But there was one melancholy part. In the mouth of Loch Aline we found a great sea-going ship at anchor, and this I supposed at first to be one of the king's cruisers which were kept along that coast, both summer and winter, to prevent communication with the French. As we got a little nearer, it became plain she was a ship of merchandise, and what still more puzzled me, not only her decks but the sea beach also, were quite black with people, and skiffs were continually plying to and fro between them. Yet nearer, and there began to come to our ears a great sound of mourning, the people on board and those on the shore crying and lamenting one to another so as to pierce the heart. Then I understood this was an emigrant ship bound for the American colonies. We put the ferry boat alongside, and the exiles leaned over the bulwarks, weeping and reaching out their hands to my fellow passengers, among whom they counted some near friends. How long this might have gone on I do not know, for they seemed to have no sense of time; but at last the captain of the ship, who seemed near beside himself, and no great wonder, in the midst of this crying and confusion, came to the side and begged us to depart. Thereupon Neil sheered off, and the chief singer in our boat struck into a melancholy air, which was presently taken up both by the emigrants and their friends upon the beach, so that it sounded from all sides like a lament for the dying. I saw the tears run down the cheeks of the men and women in the boat, even as they bent at the oars, and the circumstances and the music of the song, which is one called Lochaber no more, were highly affecting even to myself. At Kinlochaline I got Neil Roy upon one side on the beach, and said I made sure he was one of Appin's men. "And what for no?" said he. "I am seeking somebody," said I, "and it comes in my mind that you will have news of him. Alan Breck Stewart is his name." And very foolishly, instead of showing him the button, I sought to pass a shilling in his hand. At this he drew back. "I am very much affronted," he said, "and this is not the way that one gentleman should behave to another at all. The man you ask for is in France; but if he were in my sporran," says he, "and your belly full of shillings, it would not hurt a hair upon his body." I saw I had gone the wrong way to work, and without wasting time upon apologies, showed him the button lying in the hollow of my palm. "Aweel, aweel," said Neil, "and I think ye might have begun with that end of the stick, whatever. But if ye are the lad with the silver button, all is well, and I have the word to see that ye come safe. But if ye will pardon me to speak plainly," says he, "there is a name that you should never take into your mouth, and that is the name of Alan Breck. And there is a thing that ye would never do, and that is to offer your dirty money to a Highland gentleman." It was not very easy to apologize, for I could scarce tell him, what was the truth, that I had never dreamed he would set up to be a gentleman until he told me so. Neil, on his part, had no wish to prolong his dealings with me, only to fulfil his orders and be done with it, and he made haste to give me my route. This was to lie the night in Kinlochaline in the public inn, to cross Morvan the next day to Ardgour, and lie the night in the house of one John of the Claymore, who was warned that I might come. The third day, to be set across one loch at Corran, and another at Ballachulish, and then ask my way to the house of James of the Glens, at Aucharn in Dura of Appin. There was a good deal of ferrying, as you hear, the sea in all this part running deep into the mountains and winding about their roots. It makes the country strong to hold and difficult to travel, but full of prodigious wild and dreadful prospects. I had some other advice from Neil: to speak with no one by the way, to avoid Whigs, Campbells, and the Red soldiers, to leave the road and lie in a bush, if I saw any of the latter coming, for it was never chancy to meet in with them, and, in brief, to conduct myself like a robber or a Jacobite agent, as perhaps Neil thought me. The inn at Kinlochaline was the most beggarly vile place that ever pigs were styed in, full of smoke, vermin, and silent Highlanders. I was not only discontented with my lodging, but with myself for my mismanagement of Neil, and thought I could hardly be worse off. But very wrongly, as I was soon to see, for I had not been half an hour at the inn, standing in the door most of the time to ease my eyes from the peat smoke, when a thunderstorm came close by. The springs broke in a little hill on which the inn stood, and one end of the house became a running water. Places of public entertainment were bad enough all over Scotland in those days, yet it was a wonder to myself, when I had to go from the fireside to the bed in which I slept, wading over the shoes. Early in my next day's journey I overtook a little, stout, solemn man, walking very slowly with his toes turned out, sometimes reading in a book, and sometimes marking the place with his finger, and dressed decently and plainly in something of a clerical style. This I found to be another catechist, but of a different order from the blind man of Mull, being indeed one of those sent out by the Edinburgh Society for propagating Christian knowledge, to evangelize the more savage places of the Highlands. His name was Henderland. He spoke with a broad south country tongue, which I was beginning to weary for the sound of, and besides common countryship, we soon found we had a more particular bond of interest, for my good friend the minister of Essendine had translated into the Gaelic in his by-time a number of hymns and pious books which Henderland used in his work, and held in great esteem. Indeed, it was one of these he was carrying and reading when we met. We fell in company at once, our ways lying together as far as to Kingairloch. As we went, he stopped and spoke with all the wayfarers and workers that we met or passed, and though of course I could not tell what they discoursed about, yet I judged Mr. Henderland must be well liked in the countryside, for I observed many of them to bring out their mulls and share a pinch of snuff with him. I told him as far in my affairs as I judged wise, as far, that is, as they were none of Allen's, and gave Ballachulish as the place I was travelling to meet a friend, for I thought Aucharn or even Duror would be too particular, and might put him on the scent. On his part, he told me much of his work, and the people he worked among, the hiding priests and Jacobites, the disarming act, the dress, and many other curiosities of the time and place. He seemed moderate, blaming Parliament in several points, and especially because they had framed the act more severely against those who wore the dress than against those who carried weapons. This moderation put it in my mind to question him of the Red Fox and the Appin tenants, questions which, I thought, would seem natural enough in the mouth of one travelling to that country. He said it was a bad business. "It's wonderful," said he, "where the tenants find the money, for their life is mere starvation. You don't carry such a thing as snuff, do you, Mr. Balfour?" "No. Well, I'm better wanting it. But these tenants, as I was saying, are doubtless partly driven to it. James Stewart in Duror, that's him they call James of the Glens, is half-brother to Ardshiel, the captain of the clan, and he is a man much looked up to, and drives very hard. And then there's one they call Alan Breck." "Ah!" I cried. "What of him?" "What of the wind that bloweth where it listeth?" said Henderland. "He's here and away; here to day and gone to morrow; a fair heather cat. He might be glowering at the two of us out of yon whin bush, and I wouldnae wonder. Ye'll no carry such a thing as snuff, will ye?" I told him no, and that he had asked the same thing more than once. "It's highly possible," said he, sighing, "but it seems strange ye shouldnae carry it. However, I was saying, this Alan Breck is a bold, desperate customer, and well kent to be James's right hand. His life is forfeit already; he would boggle at naething; and maybe, if a tenant body were to hang back, he would get a dirk in his wame." "You make a poor story of it all, Mr. Henderland," said I. "If it is all fear upon both sides, I care to hear no more of it." "Na," said Mr. Henderland, "but there's love, too, and self denial that should put the like of you and me to shame. There's something fine about it; no, perhaps Christian, but humanly fine. Even Alan Breck, by all that I hear, is a chield to be respected. There's many a lying sneck draw sits close in kirk, in our own part of the country, and stands well in the world's eye, and maybe is a far worse man, Mr. Balfour, than yon misguided shedder of man's blood. Ay, ay, we might take a lesson by them. You'll perhaps think I've been too long in the Highlands," he added, smiling to me. I told him not at all, that I had seen much to admire among the Highlanders, and if he came to that, Mr. Campbell himself was a Highlander. "Ay," said he, "that's true; it's a fine blood." "And what is the King's agent about?" I asked. "Colin Campbell," says Henderland, "putting his head in a bee's byke." "He is to turn the tenants out by force, I hear?" said I. "Yes," says he, "but the business is gone, back and forth, as folk say. First, James of the Glens rode to Edinburgh, and got some lawyer, a Stewart, nae doubt (they all hang together like bats in a steeple), and had the proceedings stayed. And then Colin Campbell came in again, and had the upper hand before the barons of Exchequer. And now they tell me the first of the tenants are to flit to morrow. It's to begin at Duror, under James's very windows, which doesna seem wise by my humble way of it." "Do you think they'll fight?" I asked. "Well," says Henderland, "they're disarmed, or supposed to be, for there's still a good deal of cold iron lying by in quiet places. And then Colin Campbell has the soldiers coming. But for all that, if I was his lady wife, I wouldnae be well pleased till I got him home again. They're queer customers, the Appin Stewarts." I asked if they were worse than their neighbours. "No they," said he, "and that's the worst part of it. For if Colin Roy can get his business done in Appin, he has it all to begin again in the next country, which they call Mamore, and which is one of the countries of the Camerons. He's king's factor upon both, and from both he has to drive out the tenants. And indeed, Mr. Balfour, to be open with ye, it's my belief that if he escapes the one lot, he'll get his death by the other." So we continued talking and walking the great part of the day, until at last Mr. Henderland, after expressing his delight in my company, and satisfaction at meeting with a friend of Mr. Campbell's, "whom," says he, "I would make the bold to call that sweet singer of our covenanted Zion," proposed that I should make a short stage and lie the night in his house, a little beyond Kingairloch. To say truth, I was overjoyed, for I had no great desire for John of the Claymore, and since my double misadventure, first with the guide and next with the gentleman's skipper, I stood in some fear of any Highland stranger. Accordingly we shook hands upon the bargain, and came in the afternoon to a small house, standing alone by the shore of the Linnhe Loch. The sun was already gone from the desert mountains of Ardgour upon the hither side, but shone on those of Appin on the farther. The loch lay as still as a lake; only the gulls were crying round the sides of it, and the whole place seemed solemn and uncouth. We had no sooner come to the door of Mr. Henderland's dwelling than, to my great surprise (for I was now used to the politeness of Highlanders), he burst rudely past me, dashed into the room, caught up a jar and a small horn spoon, and began ladling snuff into his nose in most excessive quantities. Then he had a hearty fit of sneezing, and looked round upon me with a rather silly smile. "It's a vow I took," says he. "I took a vow upon me that I wouldnae carry it. Doubtless it's a great privation, but when I think upon the martyrs, not only to the Scottish Covenant but to other points of Christianity, I think shame to mind it." As soon as we had eaten, and porridge and whey were the best of the good man's diet, he took a grave face, and said he had a duty to perform by Mr. Campbell, and that was to inquire into my state of mind towards God. I was inclined to smile at him since the business of the snuff, but he had not spoken long before he brought the tears into my eyes. There are two things that men should never weary of, goodness and humility. We get none too much of them in this rough world among cold, proud people, but Mr. Henderland had their very speech upon his tongue. And though I was a good deal puffed up with my adventures and with having come off, as the saying is, with flying colours, yet he soon had me on my knees beside a simple, poor old man, and both proud and glad to be there. Before we went to bed he offered me sixpence to help me on my way, out of a scanty store he kept in the turf wall of his house, at which excess of goodness I knew not what to do. But at last he was so earnest with me that I thought it the more mannerly part to let him have his way, and so left him poorer than myself. End of chapter. Chapter 17 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 17. The Death of the Red Fox. The next day Mr. Henderland found for me a man who had a boat of his own, and was to cross the Linnhe Loch that afternoon into Appin, fishing. Him he prevailed on to take me, for he was one of his flock, and in this way I saved a long day's travel, and the price of the 2 public ferries I must otherwise have passed. It was near noon before we set out, a dark day with clouds, and the sun shining upon little patches. The sea was here very deep and still, and had scarce a wave upon it, so that I must put the water to my lips before I could believe it to be truly salt. The mountains on either side were high, rough, and barren, very black and gloomy in the shadow of the clouds, but all silver-laced with little watercourses where the sun shone upon them. It seemed a hard country, this of Appin, for people to care as much about as Alan did. There was but one thing to mention. A little after we had started, the sun shone upon a little moving clump of scarlet close in along the waterside to the north. It was much of the same red as soldiers' coats. Every now and then, too, there came little sparks and lightnings, as though the sun had struck upon bright steel. I asked my boatman what it should be, and he answered he supposed it was some of the red soldiers coming from Fort William into Appin, against the poor tenantry of the country. Well, it was a sad sight to me, and whether it was because of my thoughts of Alan, or from something prophetic in my bosom, although this was but the second time I had seen King George's troops, I had no good will to them. At last we came so near the point of land at the entering in of Loch Leven that I begged to be set on shore. My boatman, who was an honest fellow and mindful of his promise to the catechist, would fain have carried me on to Ballachulish, but as this was to take me farther from my secret destination, I insisted, and was set on shore at last under the wood of Lettermore, or Lettervore, as I have heard it both ways, in Alan's country of Appin. This was a wood of birches growing on a steep craggy side of a mountain that overhung the loch. It had many openings and ferny howes, and a road or bridle track ran north and south through the midst of it, by the edge of which, where was a spring, I sat down to eat some oat bread of Mr. Henderland's, and think upon my situation. Here I was not only troubled by a cloud of stinging midges, but far more by the doubts of my mind. What I ought to do, why I was going to join myself with an outlaw and a would-be murderer like Alan, whether I should not be acting more like a man of sense, to tramp back to the south country direct, by my own guidance and at my own charges, and what Mr. Campbell or even Mr. Henderland would think of me if they should learn my folly and presumption, these were the doubts that now began to come in on me stronger than ever. As I was so sitting and thinking, a sound of men and horses came to me through the wood, and presently after, at a turning of the road, I saw 4 travellers come into view. The way was in this part so rough and narrow that they came single and led their horses by the reins. The first was a great red-headed gentleman, of an imperious and flushed face, who carried his hat in his hand, and fanned himself, for he was in a breathing heat. The second, by his decent black garb and white wig, I correctly took to be a lawyer. The third was a servant, and wore some part of his clothes in tartan, which showed that his master was of a Highland family, and either an outlaw, or else in singular good odour with the government, since the wearing of tartan was against the act. If I had been better versed in these things, I would have known the tartan to be of the Argyle or Campbell colours. This servant had a good-sized portmanteau strapped on his horse, and a net of lemons, to brew punch with, hanging at the saddle-bow, as was often the custom with luxurious travellers in that part of the country. As for the fourth, who brought up the tale, I had seen his like before, and knew him at once to be a sheriff's officer. I had no sooner seen these people coming than I made up my mind, for no reason that I can tell, to go through with my adventure, and when the first came alongside of me, I rose up from the bracken and asked him the way to Aucharn. He stopped and looked at me, as I thought, a little oddly, and then turning to the lawyer, "Mungo," said he, "there's many a man would think this more of a warning than 2 pyats. Here am I on my road to Duror on the job ye ken, and here is a young lad starts up out of the bracken and speers if I'm on the way to Aucharn." "Glenure," said the other, "this is an ill subject for jesting." These two had now drawn close up and were gazing at me, while the 2 followers had halted about a stone-cast in the rear. "And what seek ye in Aucharn?" said Colin Roy Campbell of Glenure. Him they called the Red Fox, for it was he that I had stopped. "The man that lives there," said I. "James of the Glens," says Glenure, musingly, and then to the lawyer, "Is he gathering his people, think ye?" "Anyway," says the lawyer, "we shall do better to bide where we are, and let the soldiers rally us." "If you are concerned for me," said I am neither of his people nor yours, but an honest subject of King George, owing no man and fearing no man." "Why, very well said," replies the factor. "But if I may make so bold as ask, what does this honest man so far from his country? And why does he come seeking the brother of Ardshiel? I have power here, I must tell you. I am king's factor upon several of these estates, and have 12 files of soldiers at my back." "I have heard a waif word in the country," said I, a little nettled, "that you were a hard man to drive." He still kept looking at me, as if in doubt. "Well," said he, at last, "your tongue is bold, but I am no unfriend to plainness. If ye had asked me the way to the door of James Stewart on any other day but this, I would have set ye right, and bidden ye God speed. But to-day, Mungo!" And he turned again to look at the lawyer. But just as he turned there came the shot of a firelock from higher up the hill, and with the very sound of it, Glenure fell upon the road. "Oh, I'm dead!" he cried, several times over. The lawyer had caught him up and held him in his arms, the servant standing over and clasping his hands, and now the wounded man looked from one to another with scared eyes, and there was a change in his voice that went to the heart. "Take care of yourselves," said he. "I'm dead." He tried to open his clothes as if to look for the wound, but his fingers slipped on the buttons. With that he gave a great sigh, his head rolled on his shoulder, and he passed away. The lawyer said never a word, but his face was as sharp as a pen and as white as the dead man's. The servant broke out into a great noise of crying and weeping, like a child, and I, on my side, stood staring at them in a kind of horror. The sheriff's officer had run back at the first sound of the shot, to hasten the coming of the soldiers. At last the lawyer laid down the dead man and his blood upon the road, and got to his own feet with a kind of stagger. I believe it was his movement that brought me to my senses, for he had no sooner done so than I began to scramble up the hill, crying out, "The murderer! The murderer!" So little a time had elapsed that when I got to the top of the first steepness, and could see some part of the open mountain, the murderer was still moving away at no great distance. He was a big man in a black coat, with metal buttons, and carried a long fowling piece. "Here!" I cried. "I see him!" At that the murderer gave a little quick look over his shoulder, and began to run. The next moment he was lost in a fringe of birches. Then he came out again on the upper side, where I could see him climbing like a jackanapes, for that part was again very steep, and then he dipped behind a shoulder, and I saw him no more. All this time I had been running on my side, and had got a good way up, when a voice cried upon me to stand. I was at the edge of the upper wood, and so now, when I halted and looked back, I saw all the open part of the hill below me. The lawyer and the sheriff's officer were standing just above the road, crying and waving on me to come back, and on their left the redcoats, musket in hand, were beginning to struggle singly out of the lower wood. "Why should I come back?" I cried. "Come you on!" "£10 if ye take that lad!" cried the lawyer. "He's an accomplice. He was posted here to hold us in talk." At that word, which I could hear quite plainly, though it was to the soldiers and not to me that he was crying it, my heart came in my mouth with quite a new kind of terror. Indeed, it is one thing to stand the danger of your life, and quite another to run the peril of both life and character. The thing besides had come so suddenly, like thunder out of a clear sky, that I was all amazed and helpless. The soldiers began to spread, some of them to run, and others to put up their pieces and cover me, and still I stood. "Jock in here among the trees," said a voice close by. Indeed, I scarce know what I was doing, but I obeyed, and as I did so I heard the firelocks bang and the balls whistle in the birches. Just inside the shelter of the trees I found Alan Breck standing, with a fishing rod. He gave me no salutation; indeed it was no time for civilities, only "Come," says he, and set off running along the side of the mountain towards Balachulish, and I, like a sheep, to follow him. Now we ran among the birches, now stooping behind low humps upon the mountain side, now crawling on all fours among the heather. The pace was deadly, my heart seemed bursting against my ribs, and I had neither time to think nor breath to speak with. Only I remember seeing with wonder that Alan every now and then would straighten himself to his full height and look back, and every time he did so, there came a great far-away cheering and crying of the soldiers. Quarter of an hour later, Alan stopped, clapped down flat in the heather, and turned to me. "Now," said he, "it's earnest. Do as I do, for your life." And at the same speed, but now with infinitely more precaution, we traced back again across the mountain side by the same way that we had come, only perhaps higher, till at last Alan threw himself down in the upper wood of Lettermore, where I had found him at the first, and lay, with his face in the bracken, panting like a dog. My own sides so ached, my head so swam, my tongue so hung out of my mouth with heat and dryness, that I lay beside him like one dead. End of chapter. Chapter 18 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 18. I talk with Alan in the wood of Lettermore. Alan was the first to come round. He rose, went to the border of the wood, peered out a little, and then returned and sat down. "Well," said he, "yon was a hot burst, David." I said nothing, nor so much as lifted my face. I had seen murder done, and a great ruddy jovial gentleman struck out of life in a moment. The pity of that sight was still sore within me, and yet that was but a part of my concern. Here was murder done upon the man Alan hated. Here was Alan skulking in the trees and running from the troops, and whether his was the hand that fired or only the head that ordered, signified but little. By my way of it, my only friend in that wild country was blood guilty in the first degree. I held him in horror. I could not look upon his face. I would have rather lain alone in the rain on my cold isle than in that warm wood beside a murderer. "Are ye still wearied?" he asked again. "No," said I, still with my face in the bracken. "No, I'm not wearied now, and I can speak. You and me must twine," I said. "I liked you very well, Alan, but your ways are not mine, and they're not God's, and the short and the long of it is just that we must twine." "I will hardly twine from ye, David, without some kind of reason for the same," said Alan, mighty gravely. "If ye ken anything against my reputation, it's the least thing that ye should do, for old acquaintance' sake, to let me hear the name of it; and if ye have only taken a distaste to my society, it will be proper for me to judge if I'm insulted." "Alan," said I, "what is the sense of this? Ye ken very well yon Campbell man lies in his blood upon the road." He was silent for a little. Then says he, "Did ye ever hear tell of the story of the man and the good people?" By which he meant the fairies. "No," said I, "nor do I want to hear it." "With your permission, Mr. Balfour, I will tell it you whatever," says Alan. "The man, ye should ken, was cast upon a rock in the sea, where it appears the good people were in use to come and rest as they went through to Ireland. The name of this rock is called the Skerryvore, and it's not far from where we suffered shipwreck. Well, it seems the man cried so sore, if you could just see his little bairn before he died. Then at last the king of the good people took pity upon him, and sent one flying that brought back the bairn in a poke, and laid it down beside the man where he lay sleeping. So when the man woke, there was a poke beside him and something into the inside of it that moved. Well, it seems he was one of these gentry that think aye the worst of things, and for greater security, he stuck his dirk throughout that poke before he opened it, and there was his bairn dead. I am thinking to myself, Mr. Balfour, that you and the man are very much alike." "Do you mean you had no hand in it?" cried I, sitting up. "I will tell you first of all, Mr. Balfour of Shaws, as one friend to another," said Alan, "that if I were going to kill a gentleman, it would not be in my own country, to bring trouble on my clan, and I would not go wanting sword and gun, and with a long fishing rod upon my back." "Well," said I, "that's true." "And now," continued Alan, taking out his dirk and laying his hand upon it in a certain manner, "I swear upon the holy iron I had neither art nor part, act nor thought in it." "I thank God for that!" cried I, and offered him my hand. He did not appear to see it. "And here is a great deal of work about a Campbell," said he. "They are not so scarce, that I ken." "At least," said I, "you cannot justly blame me, for you know very well what you told me in the brig. But the temptation and the act are different. I thank God again for that. We may all be tempted, but to take a life in cold blood, Alan!" And I could say no more for the moment. "And do you know who did it?" I added. "Do you know that man in the black coat?" "I have nae clear mind about his coat," said Alan cunningly, "but it sticks in my head that it was blue." "Blue or black, do ye know him?" said I.
I couldn't just conscientiously swear to him," says Alan. "He gaed very close by me, to be sure, but it's a strange thing that I should just have been tying my brogues." "Can you swear that you don't know him, Alan?" I cried, half angered, half in a mind to laugh at his evasions. "Not yet," says he, "but I have a grand memory for forgetting, David." "And yet there was one thing I saw clearly," said I, "and that was, that you exposed yourself and me to draw the soldiers." "It's very likely," said Alan, "and so would any gentleman. You and me were innocent of that transaction." "The better reason, since we were falsely suspected, that we should get clear," I cried. "The innocent should surely come before the guilty." "Why, David," said he, "the innocent have aye a chance to get assoiled in court; but for the lad that shot the bullet, I think the best place for him will be the heather. Them that havena dipped their hands in any little difficulty should be very mindful of the case of them that have; and that is the good Christianity. For if it was the other way round about, and the lad whom I couldnae just clearly see had been in our shoes, and we in his, as might very well have been, I think we would be a good deal obliged to him ourselves if he would draw the soldiers." When it came to this, I gave Alan up. But he looked so innocent all the time, and was in such clear good faith in what he said, and so ready to sacrifice himself for what he deemed his duty, that my mouth was closed. Mr. Henderland's words came back to me, that we ourselves might take a lesson by these wild Highlanders. Well, here I had taken mine. Alan's morals were all tale first, but he was ready to give his life for them, such as they were. "Alan," said I, "I'll not say it's the good Christianity as I understand it, but it's good enough; and here I offer you my hand for the second time." Whereupon he gave me both of his, saying surely I had cast a spell upon him, for he could forgive me anything. Then he grew very grave, and said we had not much time to throw away, but must both flee that country, he because he was a deserter, and the whole of Appin would now be searched like a chamber, and every one obliged to give a good account of himself, and I, because I was certainly involved in the murder. "Oh," says I, willing to give him a little lesson, "I have no fear of the justice of my country." "As if this was your country," said he, "or as if you would be tried here, in a country of Stewarts." "It's all Scotland," said I. "Man, I whiles wonder at ye," said Alan. "This is a Campbell that's been killed. Well, it'll be tried in Inverara, the Campbell's head place, with 15 Campbells in the jury box, and the biggest Campbell of all, and that's the Duke, sitting cocking on the bench. Justice, David! The same justice by all the world as Glenure found while ago at the roadside." This frightened me a little, I confess, and would have frightened me more if I had known how nearly exact were Alan's predictions. Indeed, it was but in one point that he exaggerated, there being but 11 Campbells on the jury; though as the other 4 were equally in the Duke's dependence, it mattered less than might appear. Still, I cried out that he was unjust to the Duke of Argyle, who, for all he was a Whig, was yet a wise and honest nobleman. "Hoot!" said Alan, "the man's a Whig, no doubt; but I would never deny he was a good chieftain to his clan. And what would the clan think if there was a Campbell shot, and nobody hanged, and their own chief the Justice General? But I have often observed," said Alan, "that you low country bodies have no clear idea of what's right and wrong." At this I did at last laugh out aloud, when to my surprise Alan joined in, and laughed as merrily as myself. "Na, na," said he, "we in the Highlands, David, and when I tell ye to run, take my word, and run. No doubt it's a hard thing to skulk and starve in the heather, but it's harder yet to lie shackled in a redcoat prison." I asked him whither we should flee, and as he told me to the lowlands, I was a little better inclined to go with him; for indeed I was growing impatient to get back and have the upper hand of my uncle. Besides, Alan made so sure there would be no question of justice in the matter, that I began to be afraid he might be right. Of all deaths, I would truly like least to die by the gallows; and the picture of that uncanny instrument came into my head with extraordinary clearness, as I had once seen it engraved at the top of a pedlar's ballad, and took away my appetite for courts of justice. "I'll chance it, Alan," said I. "I'll go with you." "But mind ye," said Alan, "it's no small thing. Ye maun lie bare and hard, and brook many an empty belly. Your bed shall be the moorcock's, and your life shall be like the haunted deer's, and ye shall sleep with your hand upon your weapons. Ay, man, ye shall taggle many a weary foot, or we get clear. I tell ye this at the start, for it's a life that I ken well. But if ye ask what other chance ye have, I answer, none. Either take to the heather with me, or else hang." "And that's a choice very easily made," said I, and we shook hands upon it. "And now let's take another keek at the red coats," says Alan, and he led me to the northeastern fringe of the wood. Looking out between the trees, we could see a great side of mountain, running down exceeding steep into the waters of the loch. It was a rough part, all hanging stone, and heather, and big scrogs of birchwood; and away at the far end towards Balachulish, little wee red soldiers were dipping up and down over hill and howe, and growing smaller every minute. There was no cheering now, for I think they had other uses for what breath was left them; but they still stuck to the trail, and doubtless thought that we were close in front of them. Alan watched them, smiling to himself. "Ay," said he, "they'll be gey weary before they've got to the end of that employ. And so you and me, David, can sit down and eat a bite, and breathe a bit longer, and take a dram from my bottle. Then we'll strike for Aucharn, the house of my kinsman, James of the Glens, where I must get my clothes and my arms, and money to carry us along; and then, David, we'll cry 'Forth, fortune!' and take a cast among the heather." So we sat again and ate and drank, in a place whence we could see the sun going down into a field of great, wild, and houseless mountains, such as I was now condemned to wander in with my companion. Partly as we so sat, and partly afterwards, on the way to Aucharn, each of us narrated his adventures; and I shall here set down so much of Alan's as seems either curious or needful. It appears he ran to the bulwarks as soon as the wave was past, saw me, and lost me, and saw me again, as I tumbled in the roost, and at last had one glimpse of me clinging on the yard. It was this that put him in some hope I would maybe get to land after all, and made him leave those clues and messages which had brought me, for my sins, to that unlucky country of Appin. In the meanwhile, those still on the brig had got the skiff launched, and one or two were on board of her already, when there came a second wave greater than the first, and heaved the brig out of her place, and would certainly have sent her to the bottom, had she not struck and caught on some projection of the reef. When she had struck first, it had been bows on, so that the stern had hitherto been lowest; but now her stern was thrown in the air, and the bows plunged under the sea, and with that, the water began to pour into the forescuttle like the pouring of a mill dam. It took the colour out of Alan's face even to tell what followed. For there were still two men lying impotent in their bunks, and these, seeing the water pour in and thinking the ship had foundered, began to cry out aloud, and that with such harrowing cries that all who were on deck tumbled one after another into the skiff and fell to their oars. They were not 200 yards away when there came a third great sea, and at that the brig lifted clean over the reef, her canvas filled for a moment, and she seemed to sail in chase of them, but settling all the while; and presently she drew down and down, as if a hand were drawing her, and the sea closed over the Covenant of Dysart. Never a word they spoke as they pulled ashore, being stunned with the horror of that screaming; but they had scarce set foot upon the beach when Hoseason woke up, as if out of a muse, and bade them lay hands upon Alan. They hung back indeed, having little taste for the employment; but Hoseason was like a fiend, crying that Alan was alone, that he had a great sum about him, that he had been the means of losing the brig and drowning all their comrades, and that here was both revenge and wealth upon a single cast. It was 7 against 1; in that part of the shore there was no rock that Alan could set his back to, and the sailors began to spread out and come behind him. "And then," said Alan, "the little man with the red head. I havenae mind of the name that he is called." "Riach," I said. "Ay," said Alan, "Riach. Well, it was him that took up the clubs for me, asked the men if they werenae feared of a judgment, and says he, 'Dod, I'll put my back to the Highlandmans myself.' There's none such an entirely bad little man, yon little man with the red head," said Alan. "He has some spunks of decency." "Well," said I, "he was kind to me, in his way." "And so was he to Alan," said he; "and by my troth, I found his way a very good one. But ye see, David, the loss of the ship and the cries of these poor lads set very ill upon the man, and I'm thinking that would be the cause of it." "Well, I would think so," says I, "for he was as keen as any of the rest at the beginning. But how did Hoseason take it?" "It sticks in my mind that he would take it very ill," says Alan. "But the little man cried to me to run, and indeed I thought it was a good observe, and ran. The last that I saw they were all in a knot upon the beach, like folk that were not agreeing very well together." "What do you mean by that?" said I. "Well, the fists were going," said Alan, "and I saw one man go down like a pair of breeks. But I thought it would be better no to wait. Ye see, there's a strip of Campbell's in that end of Mull, which is no good company for a gentleman like me. If it hadnae been for that, I would have waited and looked for ye myself, let alone giving a hand to the little man." It was droll how Alan dwelt on Mr. Riach's stature; for, to say the truth, the one was not much smaller than the other. "So," says he, continuing, "I set my best foot forward, and whenever I met in with any one, I cried out there was a wreck ashore. Man, they didnae stop to fash with me. Ye should have seen them linking for the beach. And when they got there, they found they had the pleasure of a run, which is aye good for a Campbell. I'm thinking it was a judgment on the clan that the brig went down in the lump and didnae break. But it was a very unlucky thing for you, that same; for if any wreck had come ashore, they would have hunted high and low, and would soon have found ye." End of chapter. Chapter 19 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 19. The House of Fear. Night fell as we were walking, and the clouds, which had broken up in the afternoon, settled in and thickened, so that it fell, for the season of the year, extremely dark. The way we went was over rough mountain sides, and though Alan pushed on with an assured manner, I could by no means see how he directed himself. At last, about 10:30 of the clock, we came to the top of a brae, and saw lights below us. It seemed a house door stood open and let out a beam of fire and candlelight, and all round the house and steading 5 or 6 persons were moving hurriedly about, each carrying a lighted brand. "James must have tint his wits," said Alan. "If this was the soldiers instead of you and me, he would be in a bonny mess. But I dare say he'll have a sentry on the road, and he would ken well enough no soldiers would find the way that we came." Hereupon he whistled 3 times in a particular manner. It was strange to see how, at the first sound of it, all the moving torches came to a stand, as if the bearers were affrighted, and how, at the third, the bustle began again as before. Having thus set folks' minds at rest, we came down the brae, and were met at the yard gate, for this place was like a well-doing farm, by a tall, handsome man of more than 50, who cried out to Alan in the Gaelic. "James Stewart," said Alan, "I will ask you to speak in Scotch, for here is a young gentleman with me that has none of the other. This is him," he added, putting his arm through mine, "a young gentleman of the lowlands, and a laird in his country too, but I'm thinking it will be the better for his health if we give his name the go-by." James of the Glens turned to me for a moment, and greeted me courteously enough. The next he had turned to Alan. "This has been a dreadful accident," he cried. "It will bring trouble on the country," and he wrung his hands. "Hoots!" said Alan. "Ye must take the sorrow with the sweet, man. Colin Roy is dead, and be thankful for that." "Ay," said James, "and by my troth I wish he was alive again. It's all very fine to blow and boast beforehand, but now it's done, Alan, and who's to bear the wyte of it? The accident fell out in Appin. Mind ye that, Alan. It's Appin that must pay, and I'm a man that has a family." While this was going on, I looked about me at the servants. Some were on ladders, digging in the thatch of the house or the farm buildings, from which they brought out guns, swords, and different weapons of war. Others carried them away, and by the sound of mattock blows from somewhere farther down the brae, I supposed they buried them. Though they were all so busy, there prevailed no kind of order in their efforts. Men struggled together for the same gun and ran into each other with their burning torches, and James was continually turning about from his talk with Alan, to cry out orders which were apparently never understood. The faces in the torchlight were like those of people overcome with hurry and panic, and though none spoke above his breath, their speech sounded both anxious and angry. It was about this time that a lassie came out of the house carrying a pack or bundle, and it has often made me smile to think how Alan's instinct awoke at the mere sight of it. "What's that the lassie has?" he asked. "We're just setting the house in order, Alan," said James, in his frightened and somewhat fawning way. "They'll search Appin with candles, and we must have all things straight. We're digging the bit guns and swords into the moss, ye see, and these, I am thinking, will be your own French clothes. We'll be to bury them, I believe." "Bury my French clothes!" cried Alan. "Troth, no!" And he laid hold upon the packet, and retired into the barn to shift himself, recommending me in the meanwhile to his kinsman. James carried me accordingly into the kitchen, and sat down with me at table, smiling and talking at first in a very hospitable manner. But presently the gloom returned upon him; he sat frowning and biting his fingers, only remembered me from time to time, and then gave me but a word or two and a poor smile, and back into his private terrors. His wife sat by the fire and wept, with her face in her hands. Her eldest son was crouched upon the floor, running over a great mass of papers and now and again setting one alight and burning it to the bitter end. All the while a servant lass with a red face was rummaging about the room, in a blind hurry of fear, and whimpering as she went, and every now and again one of the men would thrust in his face from the yard and cry for orders. At last James could keep his seat no longer, and begged my permission to be so unmannerly as walk about. "I am but poor company altogether, sir," says he, "but I can think of nothing but this dreadful accident, and the trouble it is like to bring upon quite innocent persons." A little after he observed his son burning a paper which he thought should have been kept, and at that his excitement burst out so that it was painful to witness. He struck the lad repeatedly. "Are you gone gyte?" he cried. "Do you wish to hang your father?" And forgetful of my presence, carried on at him a long time together in the Gaelic, the young man answering nothing, only the wife, at the name of hanging, throwing her apron over her face and sobbing out louder than before. This was all wretched for a stranger like myself to hear and see, and I was right glad when Alan returned, looking like himself in his fine French clothes, though, to be sure, they were now grown almost too battered and withered to deserve the name of fine. I was then taken out in my turn by another of the sons, and given that change of clothing of which I had stood so long in need, and a pair of Highland brogues made of deer leather, rather strange at first, but after a little practice very easy to the feet. By the time I came back Alan must have told his story, for it seemed understood that I was to fly with him, and they were all busy upon our equipment. They gave us each a sword and pistols, though I professed my inability to use the former, and with these and some ammunition, a bag of oatmeal, an iron pan, and a bottle of right French brandy, we were ready for the heather. Money, indeed, was lacking. I had about 2 guineas left. Alan's belt having been dispatched by another hand, that trusty messenger had no more than 17 pence to his whole fortune, and as for James, it appears he had brought himself so low with journeys to Edinburgh and legal expenses on behalf of the tenants, that he could only scrape together 3 and 5 pence halfpenny,
the most of it in coppers.
"This'll no do," said Alan.
"You must find a safe bit somewhere near by," said James, "and get word sent to me. Ye see, you'll have to get this business prettily off, Alan. This is no time to be stayed for a guinea or two. They're sure to get wind of ye, sure to seek ye, and by my way of it, sure to lay on ye the wyte of this day's accident. If it falls on you, it falls on me that am your near kinsman, and harboured ye while ye were in the country. And if it comes on me—" He paused and bit his fingers, with a white face. "It would be a painful thing for our friends if I was to hang," said he.
"It would be an ill day for Appin," says Alan.
"It's a day that sticks in my throat," said James. "O, man, Alan, you and me have spoken like two fools!" he cried, striking his hand upon the wall so that the house rang again.
"Well, and that's true, too," said Alan. "And my friend from the lowlands here," nodding at me, "gave me a good word upon that head, if I would only listen to him."
"But see here," said James, returning to his former manner, "if they lay me by the heels, Alan, it's then that you'll be needing the money. For with all that I have said, and that you have said, it will look very black against the two of us, do ye mark that? Well, follow me out, and I'll see that I'll have to get a paper out against ye myself, have to offer a reward for ye. Ay, will I! It's a sore thing to do between such near friends, but if I get the dirtim of this dreadful accident, I'll have to fend for myself, man. Do ye see that?"
He spoke with a pleading earnestness, taking Alan by the breast of the coat. "Ay," said Alan, "I see that."
"And you'll have to be clear of the country, Alan. Ay, and clear of Scotland. You and your friend from the Lowlands, too. For I'll have to paper your friend from the Lowlands. You see that, Alan? Say that you see that."
I thought Alan flushed a bit.
"This is unco hard on me that brought him here, James,"
said he, throwing his head back.
"It's like making me a traitor." "No, Alan, man," cried James. "Look things in the face. He'll be papered anyway. Mungo Campbell'll be sure to paper him. What matters if I paper him too? And then, Alan, I'm a man that has a family."
And then, after a little pause on both sides,
"And, Alan, it'll be a jury of Campbells," said he.
"There's one thing," said Alan, musingly, "that nobody kens his name."
"Nor yet they shallna, Alan. There's my hand on that,"
cried James, for all the world as if he had really known my name and was foregoing some advantage.
"But just the habit he was in, and what he looked like, and his age and the like, I couldnae well do less."
"I wonder at your father's son," cried Alan, sternly. "Would ye sell the lad with a gift? Would ye change his clothes and then betray him?"
"No, no, Alan," said James. "No, no, the habit he took off, the habit Mungo saw him in."
But I thought he seemed crestfallen, indeed. He was clutching at every straw. And all the time, I dare say, saw the faces of his hereditary foes on the bench, and in the jury box, and the gallows in the background. "Well, sir," says Alan, turning to me, "what say ye to that? Ye're here under the safeguard of my honour, and it's my part to see nothing done but what shall please you." "I have but one word to say," said I, "for to all this dispute I am a perfect stranger. But the plain common sense is to set the blame where it belongs, and that is on the man who fired the shot. Paper him, as you call it, set the hunt on him, and let honest, innocent folk show their faces in safety." But at this both Alan and James cried out in horror, bidding me hold my tongue, for that was not to be thought of, and asking me what the Camerons would think, which confirmed me it must have been a Cameron from Mamore that did the act. And if I did not see that the lad might be caught—
"Ye havena surely thought of that?"
said they with such innocent earnestness that my hands dropped at my side and I despaired of argument. "Very well, then," said I. "Paper me, if you please. Paper Alan. Paper King George! We're all three innocent, and that seems to be what's wanted. But at least, sir," said I to James, recovering from my little fit of annoyance,
I am Alan's friend, and if I can be helpful to friends of his, I will not stumble at the risk." I thought it best to put a fair face on my consent, for I saw Alan troubled, and besides, thinks I to myself, as soon as my back is turned, they will paper me, as they call it, whether I consent or not. But in this I saw I was wrong, for I had no sooner said the words than Mrs. Stewart leaped out of her chair, came running over to us, and wept first upon my neck and then on Alan's, blessing God for our goodness to her family. "As for you, Alan, it was no more than your bounden duty," she said. "But for this lad that has come here, and seen us at our worst, and seen the good man fleeching like a suitor, him that by right should give his commands like any king. As for you, my lad," she says, "my heart is where not to have your name, but I have your face, and as long as my heart beats under my bosom, I will keep it, and think of it, and bless it." And with that she kissed me, and burst once more into such sobbing that I stood abashed. "Hoot, hoot!" said Alan, looking mighty silly. "The day comes unco soon in this month of July, and tomorrow there'll be a fine to do in Appin, a fine riding of dragoons, and crying of 'Cracan!' and running of redcoats, and it behooves you and me to the sooner be gone." Thereupon we said farewell, and set out again, bending somewhat eastwards, in a fine, mild, dark night, and over much the same broken country as before. End of chapter. Chapter 20 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 20. The Flight in the Heather, the Rocks. Sometimes we walked, sometimes ran, and as it drew on to morning, walked ever the less and ran the more. Though upon its face that country appeared to be a desert, yet there were huts and houses of the people, of which we must have passed more than 20, hidden in quiet places of the hills. When we came to one of these, Alan would leave me in the way, and go himself and rap upon the side of the house, and speak a while at the window with some sleeper awakened. This was to pass the news, which in that country was so much of a duty that Alan must pause to attend to it even while fleeing for his life, and so well attended to by others, that in more than half of the houses where we called they had already heard of the murder. In the others, as well as I could make out, standing back at a distance and hearing a strange tongue, the news was received with more of consternation than surprise. For all our hurry, day began to come in while we were still far from any shelter. It found us in a prodigious valley, strewn with rocks and where ran a foaming river. Wild mountains stood around it. There grew there neither grass nor trees, and I have sometimes thought since then that it may have been the valley called Glencoe, where the massacre was in the time of King William. But for the details of our itinerary I am all to seek, our way lying now by short cuts, now by great detours, our pace being so hurried, our time of journeying usually by night, and the names of such places as I asked and heard being in the Gaelic tongue and the more easily forgotten. The first peep of morning then showed us this horrible place, and I could see Alan knit his brow. "This is no fit place for you and me," he said. "This is the place they're bound to watch." And with that he ran harder than ever down to the water side, in a part where the river was split in two among 3 rocks. It went through with a horrid thundering that made my belly quake, and there hung over the Lynn a little mist of spray. Alan looked neither to the right nor to the left, but jumped clean upon the middle rock, and fell there on his hands and knees to check himself, for that rock was small, and he might have pitched over on the far side. I had scarce time to measure the distance, or to understand the peril before I had followed him, and he had caught and stopped me. So there we stood, side by side upon a small rock slippery with spray, a far broader leap in front of us, and the river dinning upon all sides.
When I saw where I was, there came on me a deadly sickness of fear, and I put my hand over my eyes. Alan took me and shook me. I saw he was speaking, but the roaring of the falls and the trouble of my mind prevented me from hearing. Only I saw his face was red with anger, and that he stamped upon the rock. The same look showed me the water raging by, and the mist hanging in the air, and with that I covered my eyes again and shuddered. The next minute Alan had set the brandy bottle to my lips, and forced me to drink about a gill, which sent the blood into my head again. Then, putting his hands to his mouth, and his mouth to my ear, he shouted, "Hang or drown!" and turning his back upon me, leaped over the farther branch of the stream, and landed safe. I was now alone upon the rock, which gave me the more room. The brandy was singing in my ears. I had this good example fresh before me, and just wit enough to see that if I did not leap at once I should never leap at all. I bent low on my knees, and flung myself forth, with that kind of anger of despair that has sometimes stood me instead of courage. Sure enough, it was but my hands that reached the full length. These slipped, caught again, slipped again, and I was sliddering back into the lynn, when Alan seized me, first by the hair, then by the collar, and with a great strain dragged me into safety. Never a word he said, but set off running again for his life, and I must stagger to my feet and run after him. I had been weary before, but now I was sick and bruised, and partly drunken with the brandy. I kept stumbling as I ran. I had a stitch that came near to overmaster me, and when at last Alan paused under a great rock that stood there among a number of others, it was none too soon for David Balfour. A great rock, I have said, but by rights it was two rocks leaning together at the top, both some 20 feet high, and at the first sight inaccessible. Even Alan, though you may say he had as good as 4 hands, failed twice in an attempt to climb them, and it was only at the third trial, and then by standing on my shoulders and leaping up with such force as I thought must have broken my collarbone, that he secured a lodgment. Once there, he let down his leathern girdle, and with the aid of that and a pair of shallow footholds in the rock, I scrambled up beside him. Then I saw why we had come there, for the two rocks, being both somewhat hollow at the top and sloping one to the other, made a kind of dish or saucer, where as many as 3 or 4 men might have lain hidden. All this while Alan had not said a word, and had run and climbed with such a savage, silent frenzy of hurry, that I knew that he was in mortal fear of some miscarriage. Even now we were on the rock he said nothing, nor so much as relaxed the frowning look upon his face, but clapped flat down, and keeping only one eye above the edge of our place of shelter, scouted all round the compass. The dawn had come quite clear. We could see the stony sides of the valley, and its bottom, which was bestrewed with rocks, and the river which went from one side to another, and made white falls, but nowhere the smoke of a house, nor any living creature but some eagles screaming round a cliff. Then at last Alan smiled. "Ay," said he, "now we have a chance." And then looking at me with some amusement, "Ye're no very gleg at the jumping," said he. At this I suppose I coloured with mortification, for he added at once, "Hoots! Small blame to ye. To be feared of a thing and yet to do it, is what makes the prettiest kind of a man. And then there was water there, and water's a thing that dauntons even me. No, no," said Alan, "it's no you that's to blame, it's me." I asked him why. "Why," said he, "I have proved myself a gomeril this night. For first of all I take a wrong road, and that in my own country of Appin, so that the day has caught us where we should never have been, and thanks to that, we lie here in some danger and mair discomfort. And next, which is the worst of the two, for a man that has been so much among the heather as myself, I have come wanting a water bottle, and here we lie for a long summer's day with naething but neat spirit. Ye may think that a small matter, but before it comes night, David, ye'll give me news of it." I was anxious to redeem my character, and offered, if he would pour out the brandy, to run down and fill the bottle at the river. "It would not waste the good spirit either," says he. "It's been a good friend to you this night.
or in my poor opinion ye would still be cocking on yon stone. And what's more," says he, "ye may have observed, you that's a man of so much penetration, that Alan Breck Stewart was perhaps walking quicker than his ordinaire." "You?" I cried. "You were running fit to burst." "Was I so?" says he. "Well, then, you may depend upon it, there was no time to be lost. And now here is enough said. Gang you to your sleep, lad, and I'll watch." Accordingly, I lay down to sleep. A little peaty earth had drifted in between the top of the two rocks, and some bracken grew there, to be a bed to me. The last thing I heard was still the crying of the eagles. I dare say it would be 9 in the morning when I was roughly awakened and found Alan's hand pressed upon my mouth. "Whisht!" he whispered. "Ye were snoring." "Well," said I, surprised at his anxious and dark face, "and why not?" He peered over the edge of the rock and signed me to do the like. It was now high day, cloudless and very hot. The valley was as clear as in a picture. About half a mile up the water was a camp of redcoats. A big fire blazed in their midst, at which some were cooking, and near by, on the top of a rock about as high as ours, there stood a sentry, with the sun sparkling on his arms. All the way down along the riverside were posted other sentries, here near together, there widelier scattered, some planted like the first, on places of command, some on the ground level and marching and counter-marching, so as to meet half-way. Higher up the glen, where the ground was more open, the chain of posts was continued by horse soldiers, whom we could see in the distance riding to and fro. Lower down, the infantry continued, but as the stream was suddenly swelled by the confluence of a considerable burn, they were more widely set, and only watched the fords and stepping stones. I took but one look at them, and ducked again into my place. It was strange indeed to see this valley, which had lain so solitary in the hour of dawn, bristling with arms and dotted with the redcoats and breeches. "Ye see," said Alan, "this was what I was afraid of, Davy, that they would watch the burn side. They began to come in about 2 hours ago, and, man, you're a grand hand at the sleeping. We're in a narrow place. If they get up the sides of the hill, they could easy spy us with a glass. But if they'll only keep in the foot of the valley, we'll do yet. The posts are thinner down the water, and come night we'll try our hand at getting by them." "And what are we to do till night?" I asked. "Lie here," says he, "and burstle." That one good Scotch word, burstle, was indeed the most of the story of the day that we had now to pass. You are to remember that we lay on the bare top of a rock, like scones upon a girdle. The sun beat upon us cruelly, the rock grew so heated, a man could scarce endure the touch of it, and the little patch of earth and fern, which kept cooler, was only large enough for one at a time. We took turn about to lie on the naked rock, which was indeed like the position of that saint that was martyred on a gridiron, and it ran in my mind how strange it was, that in the same climate, and at only a few days' distance, I should have suffered so cruelly, first from cold upon my island, and now from heat upon this rock. All the while we had no water, only raw brandy for a drink, which was worse than nothing, but we kept the bottle as cool as we could, burying it in the earth, and got some relief by bathing our breasts and temples. The soldiers kept stirring all day in the bottom of the valley, now changing guard, now in patrolling parties hunting among the rocks. These lay around in so great a number that to look for men among them was like looking for a needle in a bottle of hay, and being so hopeless a task, it was gone about with the less care. Yet we could see the soldiers poke their bayonets among the heather, which sent a cold thrill into my vitals, and they would sometimes hang about our rock, so that we scarce dared to breathe. It was in this way that I first heard the right English speech, one fellow as he went by actually clapping his hand upon the sunny face of the rock on which we lay, and plucking it off again with an oath. "I tell you it's hot," says he, and I was amazed at the clipping tones and the odd sing-song in which he spoke, and no less at that strange trick of dropping out the letter H.
To be sure, I had heard Ransom, but he had taken his ways from all sorts of people, and spoke so imperfectly at the best, that I set down the most of it to childishness. My surprise was all the greater to hear that manner of speaking in the mouth of a grown man, and indeed I have never grown used to it, nor yet altogether with the English grammar, as perhaps a very critical eye might here and there spy out even in these memoirs. The tediousness and pain of these hours upon the rock grew only the greater as the day went on, the rock getting still the hotter and the sun fiercer. There were giddiness and sickness and sharp pangs like rheumatism to be supported. I minded then, and have often minded since, on the lines in our Scotch psalm, "The moon by night thee shall not smite, nor yet the sun by day." And indeed it was only by God's blessing that we were neither of us sun-smitten. At last, about 2, it was beyond men's bearing, and there was now temptation to resist, as well as pain to thole. For the sun being now got a little into the west, there came a patch of shade on the east side of our rock, which was the side sheltered from the soldiers. "As well one death as another," said Alan, and slipped over the edge and dropped on the ground on the shadowy side. I followed him at once, and instantly fell all my length, so weak was I and so giddy with that long exposure. Here then we lay for an hour or two, aching from head to foot, as weak as water, and lying quite naked to the eye of any soldier who should have strolled that way. None came, however, all passing by on the other side, so that our rock continued to be our shield even in this new position. Presently we began again to get a little strength, and as the soldiers were now lying closer along the river side, Alan proposed that we should try a start. I was by this time afraid of but one thing in the world, and that was to be set back upon the rock. Anything else was welcome to me. So we got ourselves at once in marching order, and began to slip from rock to rock one after the other, now crawling flat on our bellies in the shade, now making a run for it, heart in mouth. The soldiers, having searched this side of the valley after a fashion, and being perhaps somewhat sleepy with the sultriness of the afternoon, had now laid by much of their vigilance, and stood dozing at their posts, or only kept a look-out along the banks of the river, so that in this way, keeping down the valley and at the same time towards the mountains, we drew steadily away from their neighbourhood. But the business was the most wearing I have ever taken part in. A man had need of 100 eyes in every part of him to keep concealed in that uneven country and within cry of so many and scattered sentries. When we must pass an open place, quickness was not all, but a swift judgment not only of the lie of the whole country, but of the solidity of every stone on which we must set foot. For the afternoon was now fallen so breathless that the rolling of a pebble sounded abroad like a pistol shot, and would start the echo calling among the hills and cliffs. By sundown we had made some distance, even by our slow rate of progress, though to be sure the sentry on the rock was still plainly in our view. But now we came on something that put all fears out of season, and that was a deep rushing burn, that tore down in that part to join the Glen River. At the sight of this we cast ourselves on the ground and plunged head and shoulders in the water, and I cannot tell which was the more pleasant, the great shock as the cool stream went over us, or the greed with which we drank of it. We lay there, for the banks hid us, drank again and again, bathed our chests, let our wrists trail in the running water till they ached with the chill, and at last, being wonderfully renewed, we got out the meal bag and made drummock in the iron pan. This, though it is but cold water mingled with oatmeal, yet makes a good enough dish for a hungry man, and where there are no means of making fire, or, as in our case, good reason for not making one, it is the chief stand-by of those who have taken to the heather. As soon as the shadow of the night had fallen, we set forth again, at first with the same caution, but presently with more boldness, standing our full height and stepping out at a good pace of walking. The way was very intricate, lying up the steep sides of mountains and along the brows of cliffs. Clouds had come in with the sunset, and the night was dark and cool, so that I walked without much fatigue, but in continual fear of falling and rolling down the mountains,
with no guess at our direction. The moon rose at last and found us still on the road. It was in its last quarter, and was long beset with clouds, but after a while shone out and showed me many dark heads of mountains, and was reflected far underneath us on the narrow arm of a sea loch. At this sight we both paused, I struck with wonder to find myself so high, and walking, as it seemed to me, upon clouds; Alan to make sure of his direction. Seemingly he was well pleased, and he must certainly have judged us out of earshot of all our enemies, for throughout the rest of our night march he beguiled the way with whistling of many tunes, warlike, merry, plaintive, real tunes that made the foot go faster, tunes of my own south country that made me fain to be home from my adventures, and all these, on the great, dark, desert mountains, making company upon the way. End of chapter.